On June 15th, Belarus's long-standing leader delivered a statement that stood out from everything he had said over the past 4 years. It was not framed as a warning, nor as another declaration of Russia's eventual success in Ukraine. Instead, it marked an unexpected change in tone. For the first time in 4 years, Alexander Lukashenko appeared to acknowledge that aligning fully with Vladimir Putin's war effort may not serve Belarus well, especially as the country sits along the modern conflict zone surrounding Ukraine in 2026, where missile and drone strikes could reach Belarus within moments. After years of firm alignment, he began to soften his rhetoric. According to reporting on an interview he gave to Al Arabiya, the Kyiv Post described a sharp reversal in his messaging. Lukashenko now spoke in favor of peace between Russia and Ukraine, and went as far as calling Belarus's potential involvement in the war absurd. He also emphasized emotional and historical connections, noting that his ancestors are buried in Ukraine and that many families across both countries remain closely linked. He described a shared social fabric, explaining that Belarusian families live in Ukraine and Ukrainian families live in Belarus, particularly in the southern regions. He reflected on a time when movement between the two nations had no clear divisions, suggesting that borders once felt almost non-existent. This tone marked a striking contrast with his previous positions. For more than 4 years, Lukashenko had consistently supported Moscow, reinforcing alliances with Russia and publicly criticizing Ukrainian leadership. At one point, he even referred to Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky in harsh terms, including calling him scum. Now, however, he issued a direct apology for those remarks. He said that if Volodymyr Alexandrovich had taken offense, he regretted his wording. He also stressed that Belarus would not engage in any military operations against Ukraine, insisting that no such action should be expected from his country or from him personally. He did, however, suggest that earlier statements were influenced by fears of Ukrainian threats against his leadership, which he used to justify his previous tone. Even so, the shift remained significant compared to years of alignment with Russia. Back in February 2022, Belarus had already become deeply involved in the opening phase of Russia's invasion. While Moscow publicly denied invasion plans, forces were quietly assembling under the label of military exercises. Over 30,000 Russian troops entered Belarus under this cover, using its territory as a staging area. With Belarus sharing a 1,084-kilometer border with Ukraine, those forces crossed on February 24, 2022, launching the initial invasion phase. Russia made early advances, with reports suggesting proximity to Ukraine's leadership in the opening hours. However, Ukrainian resistance quickly changed the battlefield dynamics. Russian forces were pushed back, and international military assistance began flowing into Ukraine. The expectation of a swift collapse never materialized, and Ukraine gradually transformed into a heavily fortified military power. This outcome should have served as a warning to Lukashenko, but his cooperation with Moscow continued. Even after incidents such as the February 2023 destruction of a Russian A-50 airborne early warning aircraft at Machulishchai Air Base in Belarus, which resulted in the loss of roughly $350 million in military equipment, his alignment did not change. Joint exercises between Belarus and Russia continued, often conducted near the Ukrainian border in ways that signaled pressure and deterrence. By January 2025, Lukashenko publicly stated that he had no regrets about allowing Russian forces to use Belarusian territory, and even described Putin as a brother figure. By that point, there was still no indication of any reversal in direction. Instead, rhetoric intensified further. On May 12, 2026, Lukashenko announced selective mobilization measures for military units, presenting them as preparation for possible conflict, while still expressing hope that war could be avoided. Shortly afterward, approximately 6,000 reservists and personnel were involved in inspections and exercises. Around May 21st, trucks carrying intercontinental ballistic missiles were observed moving into Belarusian forested areas as part of joint military drills with Russia. Despite this escalation, his June 15th remarks represented a notable departure from the trajectory he had maintained since the beginning of the war. Both Vladimir Putin and Alexander Lukashenko observed the military drills closely. These exercises were designed with a specific purpose: to ensure Belarusian forces could quickly prepare and deploy tactical nuclear weapons the moment Russia issued the order. Over the course of 3 days, the drills sent a clear message about coordination between both states. By the end of the exercise period, it appeared to many observers that Lukashenko had effectively placed Belarus's military capabilities under Russia's direct control. The perception was that Minsk had fully aligned its defense posture with Moscow's strategic demands. Yet within less than 1 month after those drills concluded, Lukashenko shifted his tone dramatically. He issued an apology to Volodymyr Zelensky, stating that his previous descriptions of Ukraine's president as scum and a Nazi were expressions made in anger and did not reflect a fair judgment of a leader who, in his words, is fighting for his country's collective survival. This raised an immediate question. What caused such a sudden reversal in stance? One factor pointed to public sentiment inside Belarus. On May 20th, the New Voice of Ukraine reported that 80% of Belarusians were opposed to their country's participation in Russia's war. This internal opposition represented a major signal of resistance within the population. As Lukashenko escalated rhetoric under pressure from Moscow, a large majority of citizens were effectively rejecting any entry into the conflict. That level of domestic opposition may have influenced his decision to step back, at least partially, from Putin's strategic orbit in order to maintain internal stability and preserve his rule. However, analysts suggest that this is only part of the explanation. There are multiple forces behind what appears to be a sudden 180-degree shift in Lukashenko's positioning toward Ukraine. The first factor has little to do with Ukraine directly and is instead tied to Russia itself. During his interview, Lukashenko acknowledged a critical reality. If Belarus were to become directly involved in the war, it would be almost entirely dependent on Russia for defense support. This was not new information, but the implication was sharper than before. He admitted that such dependence would leave Belarus exposed. According to him, entering the conflict would be unacceptable and would make the country vulnerable. He also claimed he had discussed this directly with Putin, emphasizing that both leaders had agreed that it was unacceptable for the war between Russia and Ukraine to spill into Belarusian territory. This moment revealed a clearer acknowledgement of Belarus's limitations. Despite years of strong rhetoric, Lukashenko appeared to recognize the practical constraints of relying on Russia for protection. This realization was not isolated. Over recent years, Russia's image as a reliable protector of allied regimes has weakened significantly. The belief that Moscow would consistently defend partner governments has been repeatedly tested. One example came in December 2024, when Syrian leader Bashar al-Assad and his government collapsed under a rapid rebel advance. Russia did not intervene decisively to prevent the fall of one of its long-standing allies, despite years of cooperation and military support. There had also been signs of strain earlier, when Moscow reportedly grew frustrated with Assad over stalled political negotiations before his downfall. Moving into 2026, Lukashenko observed further developments that reinforced this pattern. Nicolas Maduro, who had built close ties with Russia while leading Venezuela, was reportedly neutralized following a January United States operation that resulted in his detention and extraction. Around the same period, during Operation Epic Fury in Iran, Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei was killed in a United States strike. In both cases, leaders aligned with Russia were unable to rely on meaningful Russian intervention when facing major external pressure. Additionally, in April, Russia's Africa Corps withdrew from a key position in Mali. This further reinforced the perception that Moscow's commitments could shift rapidly when confronted with strategic priorities elsewhere. Taken together, these events sent a consistent signal. For Lukashenko, they highlighted a growing pattern in which Russian support was limited when tested in real crises. Even within Belarus's own security environment, doubts had increased. Russian air defense systems had repeatedly failed to intercept Ukrainian drones and missiles targeting Russian territory, raising further questions about reliability. The broader implication, as Lukashenko appears to recognize, is that Russia's guarantees of protection are not absolute. Countries that depend heavily on Moscow may ultimately find themselves exposed in moments of crisis. This has also affected how other states view Russia, including nations such as Nicaragua, Cuba, and several smaller African countries. Observing events in places like Mali, they have begun reassessing the risks of relying on Russian backing. For Belarus, this creates a strategic dilemma. If conflict with Ukraine escalates, Russian assistance may not be sufficient to ensure security. Lukashenko has acknowledged this vulnerability directly. He stated that Belarus would be exposed and unable to rely on guaranteed protection. This recognition reflects a broader reassessment of Russia's ability to provide consistent military support. The second major factor in Lukashenko's shift is the direct military risk from Ukraine. He described Belarus as vulnerable and acknowledged that Ukrainian forces possess the capability to strike targets inside Belarusian territory. He emphasized that such strikes are not limited to frontline positions. According to his statements, Ukrainian operations have already targeted infrastructure, including civilians, historical and cultural sites, oil refineries, and industrial facilities. They are striking across all of Russia, reaching all the way to the Urals using drones. That is the nature of the war as it exists now, Lukashenko claimed during his interview. But stepping back, that statement raises immediate contradictions. If anyone is targeting civilians, it is Russia itself, and that fact is well documented. According to the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, 16,126 Ukrainian civilians have been confirmed killed due to Russian strikes, with another 46,590 injured as of May 31st. On June 15th, the same day Lukashenko issued his apology, a Russian strike resulted in the deaths of 11 people. The record shows a consistent pattern of Russian attacks on civilian areas, not Ukrainian ones. Still, the central point Lukashenko was making is that Ukraine has developed a long-range strike capability that Russia had likely never expected to emerge at this scale. Deep strike operations have become a defining feature of the war in 2026, and Lukashenko is watching infrastructure inside Russia being hit repeatedly. The scale of these attacks is significant. In May alone, Ukraine carried out its most intense month of deep strikes in 2026, targeting 18 oil and gas facilities inside Russian territory, using drones and missiles, along with additional infrastructure targets. Reports from The Economist indicate that Ukraine could reach around 800 strikes on Russian territory by the end of the year if the current operational tempo continues throughout 2026. When Lukashenko refers to Belarus as vulnerable, he is pointing to its inability to prevent similar aerial attacks. Belarus shares a direct border with Ukraine, which makes it highly exposed geographically. At just 207,595 square kilometers, it is also far smaller than Russia, which concentrates its key infrastructure in tighter zones rather than spreading it across vast distances. This creates a situation where Belarus presents an easier target set. If Ukraine were to strike, the range of potential objectives would be extensive, and Belarus would have limited defensive capacity to respond. Lukashenko himself acknowledged this risk directly. He stated that Belarus is highly exposed militarily, describing the country as being in the open palm of Ukrainian forces. He also said that key life support systems, including industrial and logistical infrastructure, would come under attack. These remarks highlight the core concern behind his shift in tone. Ukraine already possesses the ability to strike targets inside Belarus, and Lukashenko recognizes that there is little his military can do to prevent it. Economically, the stakes are also significant. Belarus generates approximately $2 billion per year through refined oil product exports, and its role as a transit intermediary for Russian oil and gas. This vulnerability leads directly into the final reason behind Lukashenko's reversal. He understands that Belarus is exposed not only in terms of geography, but across its entire military structure. The imbalance between Ukraine and Belarus is substantial. On May 20th, following Lukashenko's mobilization statements, the New Voice of Ukraine cited Ukrainian parliament member Roman Besmertny, who described Belarus's armed forces as consisting of roughly 46,000 conscript soldiers. However, he also noted a severe shortage of ammunition and equipment, particularly armored vehicles. According to his assessment, much of Belarus's stockpiled material has been depleted or redirected by Russia, leaving significant gaps in capability. Even if fully equipped, the scale of Ukraine's military operations creates a stark imbalance. Ukraine has been inflicting more than 30,000 casualties per month on Russian forces, a rate that would exceed the total size of Belarus's military in a short period of sustained conflict. Ukraine also maintains approximately 900,000 active personnel and around 4 million reservists, according to Global Firepower. Its annual defense spending reaches about $45 billion, which is roughly 45 times greater than Belarus's military budget. In addition, Ukraine fields twice as many aircraft as Belarus, along with significantly greater combat experience. It also maintains double the number of tanks and nearly 40,000 more armored vehicles. Drone warfare further expands this gap. Ukraine has developed large-scale capabilities involving millions of FPV drones and tens of thousands of medium and long-range strike drones, creating a battlefield capacity far beyond what Belarus can match. In this context, Belarus faces a force structure mismatch that it cannot realistically counter. Any direct confrontation would be overwhelmingly one-sided. Lukashenko summarized this concern by stating that the war is effectively taking place in their immediate region, and that Belarus does not want to become involved, as it could suffer the same consequences as both Ukraine and Russia. He reiterated his belief that the conflict should end through negotiations and peace agreements between the opposing sides. This position stands in contrast to his earlier years of alignment with Moscow. His previous support for Russia makes the current tone shift especially notable. Ultimately, Lukashenko appears to recognize that Belarus is not in a position of strength. It is a smaller state facing a far more capable military power, while also depending on a larger ally that may not guarantee protection. The result is a clear strategic retreat from earlier rhetoric. Whether driven by fear, pressure, or calculation, the shift signals a break from his previous posture. And as this situation develops, it remains uncertain how far this change will go. Stay tuned for more analysis on the evolving dynamics of the Ukraine war and regional power shifts. Please leave your thoughts about this content in the comments below. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.